Okay, class, this is lecture number 22. We just have 4 more lectures remaining after this one anyway. Let's have a quick refresher of what we went over the last time we were together in lecture number 21. We talked about the 1950s, 1960s. I think a wonderful period of time. 60s a little bit less than that, but 1950s was a nice period of time. We also talked about various things here like automobiles, and they changed here. They became much flashier, lower to the ground. You had these tail lights that looked like rocket ships, you know. So anyway, different type of car than what we saw from those dull 1940s anyway. And we mentioned to you about the hula hoop. Every kid had a hula hoop, Slinky, Mickey Mouse Club, and on and on and on. There's not a whole lot of test questions coming from this block of instruction here, but it was a fun period of time here, and I hope I didn't bore you too badly with that. The emergence of televisions, and we mentioned all these television programs and cartoons that were very popular, to include Walter Cronkite and the evening news. All right, that would go a long way in replacing getting your news from newspapers and from magazines. And we mentioned that polio. Polio was a big scare of that period of time. It's a big scare now, too. Pretty much an eradicated disease, but we always need to be careful with that. Talk about the space race, and Soviet Union was, they were light years ahead of the United States. I said that exaggeratingly, and it was not that much, but we were about a year behind the Soviet Union, it seemed like. Mentioned to you about Yuri Gagarin in 1961. We also talked about Alan Shepard, John Glenn, Neil Armstrong. Always fun period, fun subjects to talk about. All right, we switched over to integration and segregation. Mentioned to you about the Brown versus Board of Education. And I want you to recognize that, 1954, if you will. A little girl, 9 years of age. I don't know if I told you that. And 9 years of age, as large for her size, by the way. And somewhere through here, we mentioned now the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. I went there a couple of years ago. It's a nice high school, as a matter of fact. Rosa Parks. Then we switched over to Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the first Republican that we'd had since 1932. So it had been 20 years, you know, with Democratic presidents, and a completely different president there, by the way. All right, and 2 terms under Eisenhower were fairly effective terms. All right, his policy of brinksmanship with that of Dean Acheson, and we mentioned that about Khrushchev, the nuclear war scare that we all had, the fallout shelters, Castro, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about Castro in just a few minutes here. I wore my Cuba shirt today so that you could kind of identify with Castro, and not saying that you should offer any kind of hero worshiping towards a man. All right, and also we mentioned about Francis Gary Powers. Francis Gary Powers flying the Dragon Lady, if you will, the U-2 Lockheed aircraft. It was a spy aircraft. Of course, we denied that, and we were caught red-handed. There was no question about that. All right, but that's enough on Gary Powers. If you want to know more about that, watch the movie Bridge of Spies. So let's go back into today's lecture, and we're going to spend our time here in the 1960s for today anyway, and a good bit of the next lecture too, in lecture 23. But this was one of the most turbulent periods of time in the history of our country, and you'll see this as we go through it. And having lived through the 1960s, I like everybody else at that time, we were thinking, you know, it just can't get any worse. It can't get any worse than what today is. And the next day, it always got worse. It was just an awful period of time. The only time I think that rivals this was in 2015 when we had all these riots that were taking place. And right here where we are now here, my friends, here in 2020 and 2021, you know. So, again, a very, very turbulent period of time here. But anyway, seems like it all began, though, in the 1960s. So some of the very prominent individuals that you're going to see during that time, and let's go back here, and I want you to learn the abbreviations with this. And these are the prominent individuals here. We had John Kennedy, JFK, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, Richard Nixon, and I usually just write out the word Nixon instead of RN. The younger brother of John F. Kennedy was Robert Francis Kennedy. People called him Bobby, by the way, RFK, and then we cannot leave out Martin Luther King Jr., MLK. And I have to throw in for good measure, even though your textbook author did not do this, George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama. So let's take ourselves to the presidential election of 1960. It's going to be a really, really serious election here. And for the Democrats will go with a young man, nice-looking guy. He was a war hero. Well, I'll tell you more about that in just a few minutes. And John Fitzgerald Kennedy will get the nomination. Lyndon Baines Johnson from the Hill Country of Texas will be his running mate as the vice president because Kennedy got the nomination. LBJ did not get the nomination for the Democrats. And for the Republicans, they would go Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, he'd been the vice president for 8 years under Dwight David Eisenhower. And we also had a Dixiecrat Harry F. Byrd. I guess we need to know that birds are not hairy. Birds have feathers. Poor Joe. And so anyway, we really didn't know who was going to win this presidential election. My family, of course, we were pulling for Richard Nixon. And the results were incredibly close here. And for John Kennedy, 49.7%. And for Richard Nixon, 49.6%. Very, very close race. Like we had in the 2020 presidential election, there were claims that the election had been stolen. And the Kennedy family was very, very wealthy. And, of course, from the Republican side, they were saying the Kennedy family actually purchased the vote. They paid people to vote for the Democrats. And I don't know about that, but nevertheless, here in the Electoral College, it was not quite that close. 303 for the Democrats and John Kennedy, and 219 for Richard Nixon. So John Kennedy is elected president here. He was a Catholic. He was from Irish descent. I'll show you what he looked like here. A nice-looking guy here. And his hairstyle certainly did not reflect 1960. It looked more modern to me than it did in 1960. But anyway, war hero. Wealthy family here, prominent family, by the way. Father had been an ambassador. John Kennedy served in the United States Navy. He was a lieutenant in the Navy. He was the commander of a patrol torpedo boat. That was a PT boat. PT-109. There's been a couple of movies made about that, in which this very fast speedboat, for that time anyway, the PT boat, was broadsided by a Japanese destroyer. Now, how in the world does that happen? I mean, it would be like a barge being, like a sea-doo being broadsided by a barge. It just doesn't happen there. So we really don't know the true story about that, but nonetheless here he is hailed as a hero, rescued the members of his crew. He even put the strap of a life preserver from one of his badly injured crew members between his teeth, and he swam 3 miles or whatever it was, to a nearby island and summoned for help, and then and the crew was rescued by and large with that too. So anyway, he is recognized as a hero, but there's a lot of, shall we say, we lift our eyes about that, wondering about the true story behind it. All right, so that's John Kennedy. You can look at your textbook in that appropriate page there, and you can see with his wife, Jackie, a very, very attractive Jacqueline Boulevard, I believe was her name anyway, Wolfway. But anyway, he was not completely faithful to her. A number of mistresses. I shouldn't be telling you all of this here, to include Marilyn Monroe. It leads us to believe that he actually had a relationship with Marilyn Monroe. So that's John Kennedy. So let's go back to our camera here. The closeness of the election is going to make it quite difficult for John Kennedy to push through much of his domestic legislation. It's a challenge here. Now, his program is referred to as a New Frontier. I want you to recognize that. So we've had the Square Deal, the New Deal, the Fair Deal, and when you have to identify this on your final examination with John F. Kennedy and his program, along with the others that I just mentioned there, match up John Kennedy here with the New Frontier. Okay, so let's move on here. And an engaging personality. Today, John Kennedy is a very popular individual, but I can tell you, having grown up during that period of time, he was not so popular. During the 3 years that he was president of the United States here, gained much more popularity. After his death. So let's move on here with some of the things that Kennedy is going to push forward here. Kennedy was very, very critical of Eisenhower. He felt like that Eisenhower had allowed the missile gap, and I'm talking about the atomic warheads, atomic missiles that the Soviet Union had and what the United States had. There'd been an arms race during that period of time. One country would build their nuclear arsenal, and the Soviet Union would follow that. The United States would follow. But nonetheless here, for John Kennedy, he was openly critical of Ike and the missile gap that had been created. And when Eisenhower was asked about this, I can't use bad language in the classroom here, folks, but when Eisenhower was asked about this, his response was, how many GD missiles does it take to kill a man? So anyway, and I kind of agree with that, if you have enough missiles to destroy the world, why do we need to have more than that? All right, and then John F. Kennedy, in turn, increased our nuclear arsenal. The Soviet Union responded likewise, and back again to an arms race here. All right, for John Kennedy, he also expanded the special services. What I'm talking special forces. What I'm talking about there is the Green Berets. For the Green Berets, some of you may be familiar with that. Rather elite Army unit there, and I always had aspirations to be a Green Beret, but that just did not happen in my life anyway. And so Green Berets, and he also established the Peace Corps. Now, before I go any further, I want to go back to the Green Berets here, because John Kennedy did not establish these special forces. It had been established before, but he expanded the special forces. But John Kennedy created the Peace Corps. These were volunteers that would volunteer to go to poverty-stricken countries here, and you could actually substitute your military service by serving in the Peace Corps, and I had several of my friends that actually did that, tried to avoid Vietnam and went into the Peace Corps as an alternative. All right, now, John Kennedy also had a problem here with Cuba. Now, don't lose sight of what we talked about the last time we were together with Castro taking power, in 1959 from the dictator there, Fulgencio Batista. And if you go to Cuba today, if you go to Havana, you can find many of those places there that Batista either owned or that he frequented there, dance clubs or former dance clubs, that sort of thing. But John F. Kennedy approved a plan that had actually been originated in the Eisenhower administration. But the Eisenhower administration did not go along with this, and it was just sitting there on the table. And it was a plan that the CIA had come up with, and it was to train a small army of anti-Castro Cuban exiles. Now look at the words there so that you can fully understand this. Train an army of anti-Castro Cuban exiles. Now these were Cubans that had been exiled out of the country, probably went to Miami, Florida, went to those areas here, and the CIA would then take several thousand of those and train them and send them back to Cuba to make an invasion there and overthrow the government of Castro. And Kennedy went along with the plan. It was rather reluctant. And if you want to read an excellent book here, Killing Kennedy by Bill O'Reilly, you may not like Bill O'Reilly, but he writes excellent books with Martin Dugard, and it'll give you the best insight on the Kennedy assassination and just John Kennedy's life in general there. But nonetheless here, what's going to happen is that John Kennedy, the president, will approve this. So on April the 17th, 1961, 2,000 anti-Castro Cuban exiles invaded Cuba. They went into the Bay of Pigs. If you put this in Spanish, if you look at it on the map, it's probably Bahia de Cochinas, the Bay of Pigs. It's on the southern side of Cuba. I should have made a little sketch here of Cuba. But if you know where Havana is, Havana's on the northern side, kind of the northern western end of Cuba. And if you go due south from there, you'll be very close to where the Bay of Pigs, the Bahia de Cochinas, was located. And for these 2,000, they were expecting air support, and in fact, the air support that was going to come from largely like the Alabama Air National Guard. And right at the last minute, Kennedy called off the air power there, and the whole thing ended up being a fiasco. All right, so it's going to tarnish the reputation of John Kennedy there. We never should have done this, and certainly never should have done this without adequate military support with that. Now, what we call this is the Bay of Pigs fiasco. It took place in 1961, Bay of Pigs fiasco. I'm sitting here looking at your screen right now, and it does not look like it's a Bay of Pigs fiasco. It looks like it's a Bay of something else. So anyway, I apologize for that, but you know how to spell that. And anyway, I want to go back to myself for just a second here and share a couple of articles here. And this first article, I don't know when I clipped this from a Birmingham newspaper, but it's showing you Castro and some of the pilots that were flying out of the Alabama Air National Guard. Here's another article here. And we lost, I think it was 4 of our pilots, from Birmingham area for the Air National Guard, and they lost their lives there. And I don't mean to contradict myself, but we did have a limited amount of air support that came in before the president called off that attack. I want to share a couple of other things with you. Let's go back to here. And if you go to Havana, Cuba today, and well, you probably won't, not under the Trump administration, under the Biden administration, they may relax the restriction here on Americans going to Cuba. But if you go to Havana, you can pass by the museum that Castro had created there. And behind the museum, they have several captured American aircraft. This is one of them. Notice it's painted with the Cuba flag, but this was a CIA aircraft. I'm guessing it was CIA, but anyway, it's painted with the colors of Cuba. But this was an American plane that was actually captured there during that time in the Bay of Pigs. I'll share another one with you. This was right next to the other aircraft there. And I want you to look very carefully with this. I took this photograph a couple of years ago when Americans were allowed to go to Cuba. I've been to Cuba on 2 occasions. I love the place. As a matter of fact, I would go back. I would go back many, many times. But I was taking this photograph. Look carefully at this. Now, this is a Cuban soldier that is guarding that aircraft, guarding the other aircraft. And I stepped up to the edge of the fence, and I was taking a photograph of that aircraft. And I want you to look at his hand right here. And what he is doing right at that point, he is pulling his pistol on me and pull that pistol out. And, of course, I got my photograph, and I scampered off. I don't know what would have happened there. He might have walked over to the fence and threatened me further. I don't know. But I wasn't about to take a chance with that, because I thought it did cross my mind he was going to take a shot at me. I don't know. Anyway, so that's that. So that was a Bay of Pigs fiasco, and it did tarnish the reputation here of John Kennedy. All right, so let's move on here. And let's see here. In 1961, John Kennedy met the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. All right, I want to show you the likeness here as it takes place here in Vienna. This is in Vienna, Austria. A nice place to visit, by the way. And here we can see John Kennedy there sitting down with Nikita Khrushchev, with peaceful coexistence. That's what Nikita Khrushchev advocated there. And it appears that, that there's some cordiality that's taking place between those two individuals. And I think it was very respectful with that. But Khrushchev was quite concerned about what was taking place here with the uniting of the zones of the free world. I'm talking about in Berlin, also with that, in Germany itself, the zones where France and Great Britain and the United States were all joined together with that, And Khrushchev was also concerned about the number of East Berliners that were actually walking across to West Berlin. So let's go back to the documents camera here, folks. On August the 13th in 1961, we're going to see the beginnings here of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall. And I'll talk to you a little bit about this today, and then at a later time I'll address this topic once again. Originally, this Berlin Wall was 108 miles of barbed wire, and it consisted of 27 miles of concrete. Now, the German word for our wall is Mauer, M-A-U-E-R. So if you go to Berlin today, you will not find a Berlin Wall except for about 2 blocks of it. So, and I'm already giving away the punchline here, for a couple of lectures down the road here, folks. The Berlin Wall is going to come down. All right, so let me show you one of the beginning photographs here. This is the way it was a couple of weeks into the construction here, and I hate to keep flipping this back and forth, but you'll see this better. Here's a photograph here. And this was on, does it date it here? It says 15 August, So this is 2 days after the Berlin Wall started going up. And at first it was only barbed wire. You can see the barbed wire that was present there. Strand of barbed wire. And the soldier there is an East German soldier. And so he knows what's happening here, that a wall is going to go up. This will separate East Berlin from West Berlin. And for many people at that time, before the wall actually got too high anyway, they made an escape. They just jumped to the other side, jumped over the wall itself, jumped over the barbed wire. Here's one of the early photographs as the wall is starting to go up there. And in many places, the wall was so close to the buildings that if you were in a second story office place or a second story apartment, you could actually jump over the wall. You might break your leg or something like that, or you might climb over the wall here. But I'll show you a photograph of this, a couple of lectures down the road, where it became just so extensive here. Minefields, double walls, machine gun nests that were in turrets, and it was just impossible as the wall neared its completion with that. But nevertheless, here we did have, in the course of 25 25 years, I believe it was, that the wall was in place here. I'd have to do my math on that. We had 234 people. These were Germans that actually escaped. 234 that were killed while trying to escape, and we actually had 3,000 that did bring about a successful escape. Some people just, commandeered private aircraft, like Cessna aircraft, and just fly from one side to the other before the East Germans got real privy to what was going on with that. Okay, so let's move on here. I want to tell you another good story about John Kennedy. And this takes place here, and I'm going to have to go back to myself in just a second here, but this will take place on the 14th of October 1962, when U.S. aerial reconnaissance, we were doing spy missions and flying over Cuba. Now, what had happened here, we broke off diplomatic relationships with Cuba, with Castro, and Castro just turned to Russia, turned to the Soviet Union and Khrushchev. All right, and so anyway, these reconnaissance photos in Cuba indicated that there was the presence of tactical nuclear offensive weapons. I'll read that to you again here, folks. Tactical nuclear offensive weapons that were being deployed. And these were Soviet weapons that were being deployed in Cuba. And they had a range that would strike about 1/3 of the United States here. So we're going to refer to this next period here of 13 days, we're going to refer to it as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis. Let me share some photographs with you of that period of time. Here's John Kennedy, who was addressing the American public, and he's telling the American public that we do have this presence here. Our aerial surveillance has indicated a presence of Soviet tactical nuclear weapons, that are being deployed down in Cuba. If you were an imagery analyst in the Army intelligence, you could probably help me out a little bit better than this. But if you look at this, it has been identified as missile erectors. It tells you an oxidizer, whatever that is, trailer, I believe it is here, and so forth and so forth. This is aerial surveillance taken over Cuba. Here's another aerial photograph of that time here, showing you some of the equipment that is used in setting up these missile sites. We placed a naval quarantine, an air and naval quarantine, over Cuba. That means nothing goes in and nothing goes out. We can see these are some Soviet ships here. We can see a United States Air Force plane is flying over them. And it was 13 long days. This is complete brinksmanship, class. It honestly is brinksmanship, to see who will budge first, see who will blink back off first. Our helicopter here flying over a Soviet submarine. And finally, on day 13, Khrushchev finally was the first to blink. I don't like this. We were awfully close to a nuclear war, very close, much closer than people believed at that time. And this is a ship here. It's a Soviet ship, Russian ship. And look right in this area right here, and you can see these missile containers. And those are missile containers, or crates. And we even had the Soviets to open up the crates so that we could actually look down inside. We could fly over, look down inside, and make sure they were just not empty boxes, empty crates. You can see in this photograph here, the crates have been opened, and we can see the missiles that are being taken away. Let's see what we have. Eventually, we'll have a hotline to be established here between Washington, D.C. and Moscow, so that we don't have some person with a trigger finger, initiating a nuclear holocaust. John Kennedy talking with members of his staff there. These are senior officers, and anyway, trying to get an appraisal on it and so forth. So anyway, I did something here.